Good afternoon, and for those from an earlier time zone joining via webinar, good morning. Welcome and thank you for being here today. My name is Jim Hamilton. I'm an advisor to the department as part of their consent-based siting team, and my role here today is to help us all have an open and productive conversation. To start off, we have a few housekeeping and logistical issues to cover, and I'll run through those now. You should all have an information packet that you got when you showed up. Does anybody not have one? We can get you one. We've got one person over there needs a packet. We'll get you one right away, sir. In this packet, you will find a copy of today's agenda, speaker biographies, a contact sheet for further information, content of the informational posters on the side there, sample themes for the small group discussion, and I'll explain that later, and an evaluation form, which looks like this, which we'd love you to fill out at some point in the future. And for those on the webinar, all this information is also posted on the department's website. You also should have a booklet that you got when you came in that the department also produced recently about their consent-based siting program. The department would like to hear from you as to the design of the consent-based siting process for the management of nuclear waste facilities. To that end, we have designed the agenda today as follows, and you can follow through. Opening remarks by Professor Rosner. We'll then hear from Acting Assistant Secretary for the Office of Nuclear Energy, John Kotek, followed by 4 excellent panel members who will share their perspectives and thoughts, a question and answer session lasting 45 minutes, then a quick break. Following the break, there'll be some facilitated small group discussions to dig more deeply into the issues you've heard about today, and I'll explain more about that later. A report out session from these small group discussions will follow, and a public comment period and closing remarks. This meeting is being streamed live, and a copy of this stream along with the transcript from today's meeting will soon be on the department's website. We hope to cover a good deal of ground today on this really interesting topic, and we look forward to your collective interest and participation. Again, thank you all for being here on the web and in person. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Professor Rosner for some opening remarks. Professor Rosner.
Thank you very much. I must say that it really does give me great pleasure to be able to start off this very first open public meeting outside of Washington, D.C. that's focused on consent-based siting of facilities excuse me, that can deal with the end products of the civilian nuclear energy fuel cycle. Dealing with what is often called the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle has proven to be a challenge, not only in the United States, but basically worldwide. And examples of how not to deal with nuclear waste are unfortunately not very hard to find. In our case, in the American case, the complex history of siting our very first presumptive repository for civilian nuclear waste, Yucca Mountain, illustrates many of the challenges that are faced by anyone charged with the problem of ultimate disposal of nuclear waste. And the fact remains that the plans originally outlined in the Nuclear Waste Act of 1982 are yet to be fulfilled. Now, my view is that the recent report of the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future, which was issued in January of 2012, has laid out a path to get there that really does have a shot at success. Now, why do I say that? I say that because there are now at least 2 examples in Scandinavia and our neighbor Canada where consent-based siting for nuclear waste repositories has taken place. They've successfully located sites of this sort, and where such repositories are, in fact, now under construction. Now, you can ask, what are the key elements of consent-based siting in these 2 examples? The first one, I think, is perhaps the most important, which is a completely open and transparent process. You can't emphasize that enough. Second, ensuring that the siting process itself is ultimately viewed by all of the participants, all of the stakeholders, as a process which is viewed as a win by everyone involved. There shouldn't be any folks who view themselves as losers in this process. That's extremely important. And this means that the process needs to be structured in such a way that there's an actual competition for citing the repository. You want to find folks who actually want this, not folks who are trying to figure out how to get out from under some edict. You don't want to have relived the battles against citing that we've seen in the past. Now, what I'm personally hoping for is that this particular meeting, this first meeting here in Chicago, takes, in fact, a first step in a successful public discussion of how we can get there. So certainly, I think everyone will agree that we need to deal with the already generated civilian nuclear waste, as well as with the waste that's yet to be generated. And it certainly must be true that we have something to learn from our citizen colleagues abroad, how they were able to successfully deal with their citing process. But I'm not going to be very surprised to learn that we here in the United States, here in Chicago, can come up with additional ideas, perhaps better ones, to finally deal effectively with the back end. And I really wish the best for this meeting in this regard. So on this very optimistic note, I confess it's a bit optimistic, I give you John Kotek, the Acting Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Energy at the Department of Energy. John.
Great. Thanks very much, and thank you all for being here today. Before I get started, many of you know, the Secretary of Energy has a particular personal interest in this issue, having spent 2 years as a member of the Blue Ribbon Commission, and then, of course, having worked in the Department of Energy previously in the 90s. I served as staff director to that commission, which, as the doctor said, the report came out more than 4 years ago. Time sure does fly, but it's good to be back here with you all today to talk a little bit more about moving forward with the consent-based citing process and hearing your input. But first, I think we're going to hear just a brief set of remarks from the Secretary. So if we can go ahead and get that going.
Hello and welcome. The meeting you are taking part in today marks an important step toward resolving a challenge that I've been working on for many years. Back in 2010, before I became Secretary of Energy, President Obama and Secretary Chu asked me to serve on the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future and tasked the Commission with recommending a new plan for dealing with spent nuclear fuel and high-level radioactive waste. Currently, this material is stored on sited reactors or at DOE sites, both operating and shut down around the country. This system of managing this material is less secure and less permanent than either an interim storage facility or a geological repository. The effort to build a repository at Yucca Mountain made clear that building a repository in a community or state that did not agree to host one was not workable. With that in mind, the Commission set out a path that we hope will enable the United States to find locations where we can store and ultimately dispose of spent fuel and high-level waste securely and safely. Today, and at meetings occurring around the United States, we hope to hear from you about what a fair and open, consent-based citing process should look like. Your input will be essential to the Department of Energy's future approach to seeking a community or communities that agree to have a federal interim storage facility or repository in their area. To be clear, the Department is not yet considering any particular locations for siting these facilities. Rather, we are gathering feedback about how the process of locating such facilities should look going forward. That process will be important to removing spent fuel and high-level waste from on-site storage at nuclear plants and from DOE sites. Moving forward with a workable plan is also critical to ensuring that nuclear power remains an option for low-carbon electricity in the United States. I look forward to hearing from my colleagues about this meeting and others occurring across the country. Again, I want to thank you for coming out today to share your feedback about how a consent-based citing process should work.
Great. Thank you all. So those of you who are not, haven't been working on this issue for years or decades might wonder why somebody from the U.S. Department of Energy standing in front of you talking about this nuclear waste challenge. I thought maybe I'd start the discussion there. Back in 1982, under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, Congress assigned the duty to DOE for providing for disposal of both commercial spent fuel and for wastes arising from DOE activities. Now, we tend to lump those into the category of defense waste because a lot of the work that the Department of Energy has done, a lot of the wastes that we've generated, have been associated with defense activities. For those of you who aren't familiar with DOE, we're an agency that's about a $30 billion a year annual budget, very, very broad set of responsibilities. While we're named the Department of Energy, actually one of the biggest jobs that we have is maintenance of the nation's nuclear weapons stockpile, and the stockpile stewardship mission. But we're also a very, very large funder of basic science research as well as clean energy research. So the office I head, the Nuclear Energy Office, has responsibility both for this waste program and for nuclear energy research and development activities. We do the bulk of our work in DOE through a system of 17 national laboratories, 2 of which are here in the state of Illinois. The professor was director of our Argonne National Laboratory. I'm a former Argonne National Lab employee. And then we also operate the Fermilab facility, particle accelerator facility west of here. So DOE has a long history here in Illinois. Illinois, of course, has a long history when it comes to nuclear technology and nuclear energy, from the first controlled fission reaction at the University of Chicago Pile in the 40s, to one of the early commercial reactors at Dresden. It's a long history in the state of Illinois associated with nuclear technology. I thought I would spend a little bit of time today, again, for those of you who might not be immersed, you might not live and breathe these issues from day to day, I thought I'd start by just giving a little context, a little bit of a framework for the discussion that's going to continue today. So, mentioned the first nuclear reactor here. Actually, I now live in the state of Idaho, despite the fact I work in D.C. And Arco, Idaho, was the first town in the U.S. lit by nuclear-generated electricity. So for more than 60 years, we've been generating spent fuel and other nuclear wastes from nuclear technologies. The most of that material comes from our fleet of commercial nuclear power plants. We've got 99 reactors at, I think it's 61 nuclear power plant sites around the country generating spent fuel. Generates it at a rate of about 2,000 metric tons a year. The national inventory is about 75,000 metric tons right now. There are also the inventories of spent fuel stored at shutdown reactor sites around the country. We now have 14 of them, including one here, Zion, Illinois. We're going to hear from the mayor here shortly about the situation there. But so what is this stuff? All right, so we talk about spent fuel and it's being stored at sites around the country. What is it? Where does it come from? Why is it a hazard? I thought I'd spend just a little bit of time talking about that again for those who don't have a depth of experience in this issue. And when we talk about nuclear waste, it's useful to talk in terms of the nuclear fuel cycle. And I'll just walk you through that real quickly. Of course, uranium is something that is mined out of the ground. It's milled or otherwise purified to separate the uranium from the rest of the ore. It then needs to be converted into a gas. Uranium, when you dig it out of the ground, is about 99.3% of a particular isotope, particular type of uranium called uranium-238. And it's about 0.7% uranium-235. Uranium-235 is what you need in the reactors we use in the U.S. To drive the reaction that produces the energy. So you have to enrich the concentration of uranium-235 up to about 5%. That's done in a uranium enrichment facility. And then the fuel is turned back into a solid, into a ceramic uranium oxide, cast into fuel pellets, and then put into cladding tubes and then into a nuclear fuel assembly. And we've got a a model over here, if you didn't see it earlier, of what a commercial fuel assembly looks like. Typical assembly is 12 to 14 feet tall. That, well, I'm sure would have fit in the room. We've got a 4-foot tall version over here, but dimensionally, on the sides, it's to scale for a particular type of reactor we use here in the U.S. Right? And depending on the reactor type, you'll have between 200 and 500 of those in a reactor core. Right? And of course, the nuclear reactor is where we use this nuclear fuel to generate electricity. In the stages up to the fuel fabrication, putting the fuel in the reactor, the fuel's mildly radioactive, but you can handle it without the need for radiation shielding. But after you've used the fuel in a nuclear reactor, that's when it becomes very hazardous and highly radioactive. So what happens in a nuclear power plant is the uranium that's in that fuel is caused to fission or split. In the course of splitting, it releases a large amount of energy, which can be used to heat water, generate steam, and drive a turbine. So that's where the electricity comes from. But the smaller elements that are left over from the fission or the splitting of the uranium, we call those fission products, and that's where you get the highly radioactive stuff. Okay. Now, also released in the course of a fission is a couple of neutrons. They can go on to fission other uranium atoms, and that's where the chain reaction comes from that you've heard about. Okay. All right. So, all right. Now we're dealing with the spent fuel and the topic of today. Typical fuel assembly will stay in a reactor for something like 4 to 6 years. When it comes out, it's both thermally very hot and radioactively very hot. It needs to be put into storage before it can either be reprocessed, which is not something we do here in the U.S., but some other countries do it, so I include it here for completeness, and then ultimately for final disposition. When we talk about storing this material, as I mentioned, it's very hot when it comes out of the reactor. You need to keep it cool, right? As you can see from the fuel assembly itself, it's a pretty robust piece of hardware, but what you don't want to have happen is you don't want to have the fuel melt, right? And that's what happens in a nuclear accident. Over at Fukushima, fuel melted, you get fission products, you get radioactive material released. That's when you get into trouble. So you need to keep the fuel cool. For the first roughly 5 years after the fuel comes out of the reactor, you put it into wet storage. You put it into a water pool, okay? And that keeps the fuel sufficiently cool. After about 5 years, you can then move it into a dry storage configuration, and what you're seeing is more and more of the nuclear power plants in the U.S., the fuel pools are filled to capacity, and so they're starting to move fuel into dry storage. Of the 75,000 metric tons of spent fuel at commercial reactors in the U.S., about 2/3 is in pools, about 1/3 is in dry storage right now, roughly speaking. Okay. Now, so that's the commercial fuel. That's the biggest component of it. But you also have, as I mentioned earlier, you have wastes left over from DOE activities, typically or predominantly defense activities, although not entirely. The Naval Propulsion Program, of course, aircraft carriers and submarines use nuclear reactors, the spent fuel generated from that activity. Research and production reactors. We operate a series of research reactors around the country, fewer than in the past, but for example, out at the Idaho National Lab, there are still 3 in operation that we use for various nuclear research. We also had reactors that were used to produce plutonium or tritium for the nuclear weapons program. So you had waste associated with that. And then from the actual weapons production operations themselves. So what you've got is a series of waste forms that have resulted from DOE activities: spent fuel, glassified wastes, and then other forms like calcined waste, which is a specific waste form we have left over out in Idaho. So we have both spent fuel and then in the things that aren't spent fuel we call high-level wastes. All right? And those are all materials that are going to require long-term isolation from people in the environment. All right, this stuff will be radioactive for millennia, and you need to ensure that the materials are appropriately managed and that both people in the environment are protected from the radiation. Now, the radiation goes down over time, but it's still going to be many years that you need to keep this material isolated. So where is it? Well, as you can see from this map, mostly commercial reactor sites, predominantly in the east. I think as was mentioned earlier, Illinois has the most commercial reactor sites. Also shutdown reactor sites, some DOE sites sprinkled around the west and a couple in the east. So, we've got material stored in the majority of the states around the country that's needing long-term safe storage and then ultimately disposal. Okay. So, how did we get here? I mentioned earlier that the Congress assigned this role to the Department of Energy in the Nuclear Waste Policy Act in 1982. Actually, of course, the concern about what to do about waste management stretches back really to the early days of the Atomic Energy Commission and work on nuclear-related activities. And in 1957, one of the seminal moments in nuclear waste management was a report by the National Academy of Sciences, which looked at the disposal of nuclear wastes on land and concluded that there were a variety of options that could work. They pointed in particular to salt formations as a promising pathway. And so the Department of Energy headed down the road of looking at building a repository in salt. Through the 1960s. In 1970, announced the selection of a site in Lyons, Kansas, as a site for potential demonstration for the disposal of high-level waste and low-level wastes. 2 years later, though, the Atomic Energy Commission canceled that project in the face of questions about the suitability of the site and opposition from the state. The Department of Energy's predecessor agency spent the decade of the 70s, the rest of the decade of the 70s, looking at other formations in states around the country, leading up to the passage of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act in 1982. The process of looking for sites was truncated by Congress in 1987 when Congress directed DOE to focus its efforts on characterizing only the Yucca Mountain site. And then, of course, the application for Yucca Mountain was withdrawn back in 2009, and instead this Blue Ribbon Commission was formed to make recommendations about a new process going forward. That report came out, as was mentioned earlier, in January of 2012. In January of 2013, the administration put its strategy out, built on the work of the Blue Ribbon Commission, and in particular, pointing to the need for both storage facilities and deep geologic repositories. And as you'll hear later, we're looking at geologic repositories both for the commercial waste, but also specifically for defense waste as well, and for siting these facilities using a consent-based siting process. Now, again, as Dr. Rosner mentioned earlier, other nations have had success employing a consent-based siting process. We're not the first ones to go down this path. The example of Canada was mentioned. They're in the process now of working with communities that have expressed an interest in hosting a facility. I think they had 22 express interest, and they're working with 8 or 9 now. Sweden and Finland have both identified sites for repositories, and Finland's actually in the process of construction. I think Sweden's in the process of review by their regulator. So we've tried to learn from that. We tried to learn from those examples both in the Blue Ribbon Commission report and in the administration strategy. All right. So in where we want to go with that strategy, all right, is towards the development of an integrated waste management system. Again, with components of consolidated interim storage facilities, starting with a pilot facility, but then working up to a larger scale facility, and then also repositories, both for defense waste and for DOE waste. With a well-constructed transportation system as a part of that. And, although the, consent for disposal and storage facilities is something we're working towards, legal consent for doesn't really apply to transportation, but we certainly understand that people, and maybe some of the people in this room, have a concern about shipments. And so what we'll intend to do going forward is building on the experience we had working with states around the U.S. on shipments of transuranic waste, so waste resulting from weapons production that don't meet the definition of spent fuel or high-level waste. We went through an extensive process of working with states and tribal governments to develop a system of transportation, including training and emergency preparedness exercises, to ensure that transportation could be done safely and done well. So coordinating with the states on development of transportation protocols, route selection, shipment inspections, emergency response, and the unlikely event of an accident, those sorts of things. We're going to build on that experience and as we go forward with developing a transportation system here for spent fuel and high-level waste. I mentioned disposal. Ultimately, this stuff needs to be isolated for millennia, from people in the environment. The scientific consensus globally is that deep geologic disposal is the way to go. We're, as I mentioned, looking at developing deep geologic disposal facilities both for defense wastes and for commercial spent fuel. All right. And the way we want to get there is, again, as Dr. Osner mentioned, we want to work with communities that are interested in at least considering taking on this mission and considering potentially becoming what we call willing and informed hosts for facilities like this. So we want to work with local governments, communities, states, tribes on this so that we can ensure safe and secure operations, we can build and maintain trust, and that we can adapt our approach based on new information and changing circumstances. So what you're going to see us doing over the course of the next 6 to 8 months is engaging in sessions like this, right, to get input on what should be the elements of a consent-based siting process, what factors should be reflected as we develop that process. We'll design that process as a way to work with communities and use that process as we go forward and share information and again look for communities that are potentially interested in becoming willing and informed hosts. So at the moment, we've posed a series of 5 questions. We did this, we're doing it here. We've also done it through a invitation for public comment posted in the Federal Register, asking questions like, how can we, as DOE, ensure that the process for selecting a site is fair? What models and experience should we use in designing the process? Who should be involved in the process for selecting a site and what should their role be? What information and resources do you think would facilitate your participation? That's a particularly one that we're particularly interested in hearing your input on. We want to make sure that folks who are looking at this issue have the information that they need. And then what else should be considered? So looking forward to your input on that. As I mentioned, done that through meetings like this, the invitation for public comment, through public webinars and conference calls, and then small group meetings, trying to get input in a variety of ways. Another thing that we're hoping to do is be able to provide funding, again, to states, tribes, local governments, potentially others who are interested in studying this issue more. We have a funding request before Congress. So government fiscal year starts on October 1. We have a request for fiscal 17, which will start on October 1 of 16, into Congress requesting about $25 million to be able to issue a funding opportunity announcement and make these grants. Don't know how the Congress is going to treat that request, but we've made it of the Congress. So I mentioned we'll use that the input that we get here to design a process. And then we'll use that resulting process to work with potential host communities. So that's where we're headed. And can't thank you all enough for being here. Please provide us your input, provide it today, provide it through the website, through email. And please also take the opportunity to get to know some of the folks who are working on this issue. I've got, in particular, I'm going to point out Andy Griffith, who's over here. He's the person who runs this program for me day to day in the energy department. Great guy to get to know. We're trying to build a team that can do this job right for years to come, and Andy's leading that effort for us. So thanks again for being here.
Thanks, John. So you've heard from Professor Rosner and from Mr. Kotek describe some of the siting challenges and issues and opportunities, as well as the whole integrated waste management system. And now we're going to, personally I'm tickled pink. We've got 4 really great panelists who are going to share their perspectives on this issue of siting, what it looks and feels like, what should be considered, what's on the table, what's not. So I'm going to turn it over to them. We've got, first off, is Mayor Al Hill from the City of Zion, followed by Kim Wasserman-Yato from Little Village Environmental Justice Organization. To her left is Commissioner Ann McCabe from the Illinois Commerce Commission, And then wrapping it up is David Kraft from the Nuclear Energy Information Service. I'm not going to read their bios. They're all on your information packet. But we'll turn it over to Mayor Hill, and we'll proceed down the line. Take it away, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Jim. I am the mayor of Zion, Illinois. For those of you that don't know where Zion is, it is straight north of here on Lake Michigan, about 3 miles south of the Wisconsin-Illinois border. And we are a community of about 25,000 people that have a decommissioned nuclear power plant in our city boundaries with spent fuel rods in dry cast storage there. The Zion Nuclear Power Plant was constructed between 1968 and 1973. It was licensed by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in 1973 and began operation in 74 and was shut down in 1998. In 1968, nuclear power was relatively new. This was going to be a generation source that would provide very cheap electricity. Zion was excited to be a part of this, and we cooperated completely with Commonwealth Edison. We thought it was good for our community. We thought it was good for the state of Illinois, and we thought it was good for the United States. At the time, the people of Zion understood that locating the power plant within the community and along the shores of Lake Michigan would entail some costs. There was an understanding that the community would give up over 400 acres of lakefront, an understanding that there would be an eyesore on the lakefront that would be there for a very, very long time, an understanding that recreational access to the lake for both visitors and our local residents would be extremely limited. And we also understood that there would the economic development opportunities associated with the lakefront would be inhibited. And these are the same economic development opportunities that have been exploited by lakefront communities extending from Milwaukee to Chicago. In exchange for the cost, there was also an understanding that the Zion community would benefit from locating the power plant here. There was an understanding that there would be a lot of jobs created, and I believe at one point there were 800 jobs at the Zion plant. An understanding that each taxing body would receive significant tax dollars from the increased equalized assessed valuation of the plant. And the Commonwealth Edison, when the plant was operating, paid as much as $19 million a year to our community in tax dollars for schools, parks, and in the city. There was an understanding that when the operating license of the plant expired, that these 400 acres would be returned to pristine condition and the property returned to us for development purposes. That was the deal. It was an unwritten deal, but that was the deal that the people in Zion understood. I'd like to fast forward to today. There was never an understanding that once the plant closed, the Zion community would play host to a radioactive, and I'll be blunt here, a radioactive dump that contains 2.2 million pounds of spent fuel rods. 2.2 million pounds of spent fuel rods are sitting in our community. And the benefits that we had when the plant was operating are gone. There are no more jobs, and there's no more tax dollars, or very little tax dollars. I think they pay $1.5 million to the entire community now. And that wasn't part of the deal, that we were going to be hosting these. I speak for all of Zion when I say that we do not want to be a storage facility for radioactive waste. So what are we to do? And our answer is that someone needs to either get the fuel rods out of there or compensate the Zion community for becoming a de facto interim fuel storage facility. With Yucca Mountain being scuttled in 2010, we're not naive enough to believe that these rods are going to be moved anytime soon. We therefore believe that in the meantime, until they are moved, our community should be compensated, and we also believe that the federal government should do the compensating. In 1982, Congress enacted the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, which was intended to begin the process of disposing of nuclear waste. As part of the act, a small fee was added to electric bills intended to pay for the disposal of spent fuel at nuclear power plants. The fee was small. It was 1/10 of a cent for every kilowatt hour generated at a nuclear plant, which totaled 15 to 20 cents per month on an average electric bill throughout the country. Total up those tiny fees and you get a lot of money. By 2014, the fund had grown to over $40 billion. The 1982 Nuclear Waste Policy Act contains a section entitled Interim Storage Fund. This section references impact assistance, which says that, and I paraphrase, "The Secretary shall make annual payments to a state or appropriate unit of local government, or both, in order to mitigate social and economic impacts occasioned by the establishment and subsequent operation of an interim storage capacity within the jurisdictional boundaries of such government. Impact assistance could be as high as $15 per kilogram of spent fuel." And we have 2.2 million pounds, so we have 1 million kilograms in our community. Payments made available to the states and units of local government pursuant to this section shall be allocated in a fair and equitable manner with a priority to those states or units of local government suffering the most severe impacts. I can't imagine any other units of local government located anywhere in the country that will suffer more severely than the Zion area communities. We're talking about Lake Michigan, lakefront property that is valued at a fraction of its fair market value because of the 2.2 million pounds of radioactive waste stored on the shoreline. The Zion site can and should be freed of spent fuel so that it can be used for productive, economic, and social purposes. Zion has never been asked about and never contemplated or consented to converting the decommissioned site to an indefinite and long-term nuclear waste storage facility. The intent of the 1982 federal legislation is clear, that communities will suffer social and economic impacts if they are designated as interim storage facilities and that they should be compensated. Now, I know there's a discrepancy and there's disagreement about what interim storage facility means, but the definition of interim is in or for the intervening period, provisional or temporary. Whether anybody likes it or wants to admit it or not, Zion is an interim storage facility right now. I would like to, at this time, to formally request that the Department of Energy get with federal legislators and provide a mechanism to reimburse local communities for social and economic losses resulting from spent fuel rod storage within these communities. I would like to thank the DOE for first attempting to put together a consent-based siting process. As you can see, I'm not one of those people that wants to volunteer our community to have it, to be one of those sites. And second, for hosting this public meeting. I also want to thank Jim Hamilton for the invite to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Hill. Appreciate it. Now turning it over to Kim Wasserman-Yehill from Little Village Environmental Justice Organization.
Sorry about that, a little vertically challenged. Good afternoon. Again, my name is Kim Wasserman. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I am the organizing director at the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, and I am also the chairwoman for the Illinois Environmental Justice Commission here in Illinois. And I was very excited to be here. I will not lie, I was a little unsure of my role here, given that our community worked for 12 years to shut down a coal power plant. A little different, but I think the lessons learned definitely replicate into a community that is dealing with nuclear power plants. And so kind of putting on both my hat as a chair of an environmental justice commission, but also being a resident and working for an environmental justice organization in my community definitely made me want to lift up some very important things that I think we've heard both from the mayor today, but also from the struggles that we find in frontline communities who are next to coal power plants. And so a couple of things that I really want to raise up is in reading through the material and hearing folks' conversation, definitely for us as an organization, we have made our mark being very reactive. So we reacted to having a coal power plant in our community. Communities are reacting to having nuclear power plants or storage in theirs. As the mayor mentioned, I think a lot of times communities assumed a lot of things, thought a lot of things through the process that they went through, but the reality is an open, transparent process has to be more than just checking off a box on a checklist that says, yes, we talked to community, right? What does that actually mean? Are things being written down? Are there actual action steps that communities have the right and fully understand where their role is? Is there a framework for community to understand all the points of insertion that they potentially may have and what laws or what they have to back them up? I think in thinking about open and transparent processes, a lot of times our communities are sold on the notion of jobs and economic benefit, right? It's a very good conversation to say, this is how many jobs will be created, this is what the tax base is going to be. But a lot of times our community, because we're so caught up in this conversation, because we may be economically distraught or for whatever, any number of reasons, nobody ever wants to talk about the health impacts and the cost, the monetary cost of that associated with the other side, right? So while the job cost is great and we know what that is, what's the health cost that comes out of that? What's the mental cost that comes out of that? As we heard the mayor of Zion say, for decades, this community has had no access to the lakefront. What does that do to a community member who has no access perhaps to open space or cannot appreciate or enjoy a walk down the lakefront? As Chicagoans, many of us have that luxury because organizations here fight tooth and nail to keep our park space public, whatever your opinion on that is. They fight to keep it public because it's our right to be able to access that. What does that say for the countless community members who don't have that access? So definitely being crystal clear on what the economics are on both ends, but that also means that our communities need to access those resources. Do we have access to the science, the economists, the land use planners, the folks who are doing all the technical work for the company? Are those resources being provided to the community? If they're not, they should be. In order for community to make to be able to consent, they need to fully understand what all of this means. If we can't afford technical assistance in our communities, how are we going to be able to understand the magnitude of paperwork and explanations and definitions that are being sold to our community? Along with the economy of it as well, we really have to lift up the cultural components that we have in our communities. Not all communities are created equal. For some of our communities, our relationship with the land is an unspoken relationship that has no economic cost or cannot be written in paper. So are we understanding what the cultural components of people's relationships with their land is, aside from driving on it and living off of it? What else? How else do they connect to Mother Earth? And I think finally recognizing truly, as environmental justice communities, we can't help but want to make sure that all of the history that we have gone through is used as part of us moving forward, right? So if we're talking about processes, looking at what DOE has done in the past, there's definitely a lot of processes that people have been part of, reports that people have been part of, surveys that people have been part of. But if there is no real traction or teeth to their participation, after a while, people are going to be like, what am I participating in? Why am I participating? I'm going to get, excuse my language, crap participated out of me, right? And so at what point does that actually become tangible work on the front end? Where do actually community members get to see their work on, with pen and paper, signed off on, where they know, again, what their rights are? And the last thing I'll say is I think for us, it'll be very hard, I think, to find communities that will be willing. And I think the reality is we really need to stop the creation of this waste to be able to avoid having to continue to have these conversations every couple of years when we're trying to figure out what do we do. So the reality is until we stop creating this waste, we're going to continue to be in this space, in the same space and having the same conversation. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Kim. Now to Commissioner Ann McCabe.
Thank you. I think so. Yep. I appreciate DOE's invitation to speak today. I am here as the chairman of a nuclear issues subcommittee for the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, or NARUC. The success of the Federal Nuclear Waste Management Program, paid for by consumers of electricity generated from the nation's nuclear power plants, is of great interest to me as a commissioner at the Illinois Commerce Commission and to the rest of the state public utility commissions that are part of NARUC. State utility regulators have dedicated a tremendous amount of time and resources to ensure that electricity consumers receive the disposal services they have paid for through their utility rates. Some Illinois specifics. Illinois is the largest generator of nuclear power in the U.S. We have 6 operating nuclear plants with a total of 11 units. At the end of 2015, Illinois had over 9,100 metric tons of spent nuclear fuel stored at these sites and the decommissioned Zion plant. As of December 2014, Illinois citizens had contributed $2.3 billion to the Nuclear Waste Fund. NARUC's overarching position is that the administration and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission should comply with the law passed in 2002 and complete the process to determine if Yucca Mountain can be licensed for waste disposal. NERIC believes the goal should be progress on the permanent repository. The interim site is by definition a temporary and not inexpensive measure to bridge the gap to a permanent repository, assuming it can be cost justified. NERIC, by resolution, which is how we set our policies, has suggested that some consolidated interim storage is needed, although the amount, basis of need, and duration should be determined. One problem is how to handle the not uncommon occurrence of those near a proposed site supporting a license, while organizations and advocates both outside and in that same state lobby the governor and legislators to block any solution. Another problem is how to immunize the federal entities responsible for the nation's waste disposal program from political pressure. Applicants seeking to build storage facilities need a target, that is, what level of state and local agreement is needed to define consent. The current DOE construct outlining consent is affected communities have an opportunity to decide whether to accept facility siting decisions and retain significant local control. This definition is too general. Some of my thoughts on the consent-based siting process: considerations for site selection, level of support for the site in terms of state and local, what is the minimum level of consent needed, construction, operating, and maintenance costs for the site, communities or states with a working reactor nearby or storage sites may be logical places to start, transportation costs to the site, transportation costs from the site to the permanent repository. As far as participation and who should be involved, parties that have a legal standing, restricting participation to as few parties as legally allowed. The more participants, the lower probability of consensus. Last, financial and technical assistance will help community participation, as Kim already said. Back to the official NERIC position, we hope these meetings and comments help DOE establish more precise and useful definitions for the process. With respect to the issues before us today, DOE should not slow the progress on review of Yucca Mountain's license. Ratepayers should not bear additional costs unnecessarily just to shift the cost of interim storage from one federal billfold, the Judgment Fund, to another, the Nuclear Waste Fund. The Nuclear Waste Fund targets a permanent repository, and that must be the ultimate goal of federal authorities. Thank you.
Thanks, Ann. Our last panelist today is David Kraft from the Nuclear Energy Information Service. David?
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to make these remarks. NEIS is a 35-year-old organization. We are anti-nuclear, of course, but we are also advocates for a sustainable, renewable energy future based on carbon-free, nuclear-free systems. And we were, as I said, we're 34 years old. The very first set of public comments we ever wrote dealt with the 1982 Nuclear Waste Policy Act. So we've been around the block on this issue for a long time. I would also point out that I served for 5 years on the Illinois Department of Nuclear Safety's Citizens Advisory Group, which dealt with the unsuccessful siting of a low-level radioactive waste facility in Illinois from 1986 to 1991, roughly. And that process also was exploring the notion of consent-based siting. So we bring some experience and perspective to this discussion today. I just want to articulate our 4 positions on radioactive waste, because it will come back to what I want to conclude with at the end. Since the 1980s, as I mentioned, when we did our first testimony, we have been in favor of a permanent, deep geological repository as the nation's solution for the high-level radioactive waste spent fuel issue. In the meantime, though, in 2002, our organization participated with nearly 100 other environmental organizations to develop a set of principles on the management of spent nuclear fuel and high-level radioactive waste. And one of our recommendations that we put together then was to create a system called HOS, Hardened On-Site Storage for the spent nuclear fuel. The idea there was that we have the ability to enhance safety and security using the available dry casks, and it had been demonstrated to be successful in other countries. The other advantage to it, though, is that you don't need centralized interim storage, which would just contaminate new sites and introduce unnecessary transportation, which is our third point. We believe you should only transport the waste once, and that is from where it is to where it's going to end up permanently. And then finally, we have pointed this out repeatedly over the last 34 years, that the nuclear industry is not necessarily unique in this, but certainly violates the first cardinal rule of waste management, is that you don't make more of it if you don't have a permanent disposal solution in operation. So these are the positions and perspectives that we're bringing to the discussion here today. I'm going to start off by urging the DOE to get its lawyer team revved up, because in preparation for this, I looked up some legal definitions of what the term consent means, and you can do this too. I don't have to bore you with all of the details, but I do have an outline version of my remarks here today, which do go into some detail on what consent means. It's a binding contract between parties, but it's more than that. It's a power relationship that takes place, and it's an agreement that's made unencumbered by coercion. It's a mutually arrived at position. However, consent is not enough. I come from a community mental health background, and the buzzword in our community back then is you need informed consent, which also has a very specific legal definition. And I'm going to read that one to you because I think the DOE needs to keep it in mind as it moves forward. Informed consent is assent to permit an occurrence that is based on a complete disclosure of facts needed to make the decision intelligently, such as knowledge of the risks entailed or alternatives. And I think Mayor Hill gave a great example of those precepts being violated from the get-go. We didn't have all the knowledge then, and we still don't have all the knowledge now. We have no ability to tell a community when they will be relieved of their burden to take interim storage of waste. We don't know what technologies will be available. There are a lot of unknowns. So that makes informed consent much more difficult in this case. We were put up here, I think, to provide a context for how to move forward, and I don't think you can move forward unless you take a look at the past. You know, those who don't understand history are doomed to repeat it. And quite frankly, from our 34-year experience dealing with government agencies like the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Department of Energy, and others, it's a pretty sorry history that this process is going to have to overcome before you can expect communities to take you seriously. Just a few examples. You know, we talk about a binding agreement and a contract in a consent-based situation, yet the federal government has yet to come to a mutually satisfying agreement with the Western Shoshone tribe about the Yucca Mountain property. The Ruby Valley Treaty of 1863 was very clear. It's their land, yet as a treaty being the law of the land, we can forget about it because we have nuclear waste needs, or we need a place to explode our atomic devices. Several years later, we had the Skull Valley Ghost Chutes being offered money to create something called private fuel storage to store 40,000 tons of spent fuel. This was an impoverished tribe that had a lot of beads, trinkets, shells, and baubles dangled in front of them. The process ground to a halt, and the site was never created. But I want to point that out, that could never have been consent because it was really a situation of duress. It was a situation of taking advantage of impoverished areas, which I think Kim touched on in her remarks. I can go on in terms of this, but the bottom line here is the agencies dealing with nuclear waste in this country have an enormous credibility gap. The public lacks confidence in everything that's gone on before. Your history is very clear on how selective you are on what treaties, what agreements you will keep, and which ones you will break with or without consequence. That's very hard to get a community to trust you and move into an informed consent dialogue under those circumstances. Now, I'm just going to go down a couple of some of the preconditions we think need to be in place moving forward. And as I say, I'll be glad to discuss this and pass my comments to you in writing. First and foremost, you fix the credibility gap. If you don't keep your word on previous agreements, treaties, and contracts, first, don't expect any community to come forward and want to engage in a contract with you. Second, compensate communities already affected by the nuclear contamination and presence, and we have one of those sitting at our table here today with Mayor Hill. Zion is only one of many. There are 10,000 abandoned uranium mines across the United States that tribes like the Diné have to deal with on a daily basis because it contaminates their drinking water and their livestock. Those are the kinds of agreements that have to be taken care of first before we go down this path of trying to persuade other communities to take more waste. We emphasize the notion of informed consent, yes, but bribery, duress, and bait and switch, no. We also have to emphasize that no needs to mean no, that later you can't come back and use eminent domain if you really are up against it, which is a possibility that could happen. And finally, we have to put more effort into knowing the unknowable, addressing the fact that we really don't have all the answers on what to do with the permanent disposal of radioactive waste, and probably don't have all the answers even for interim storage and the transportation of the waste. We're doing a lot of checkbox exercises of meeting requirements. We wonder when the rubber hits the road how safe that's going to be for the United States. I would totally agree that we have to minimize the congressional political influence once a process is finally adopted. And also, if you're going to enter in an agreement, parties are bound by that, and there need to be severe penalties for violating the agreement as we move forward on this. And they have to be penalties that are really meaningful to the parties involved. So I'm going to stop there, and I guess we're going to turn it over to the question and answer phase. But if you'd like a copy of those outline remarks, I'll be glad to give them to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you very much for all panel members for your thoughtful perspectives. I think we all really appreciate it. A public service announcement. Those on the webinar, please mute your phones. We're getting a lot of reports of barking dogs and other things in the background. So take your phone, put it on mute. We'd love to have you participate, but I think we're getting a lot of feedback on the webinar, folks. Okay, now I'm going to open the floor to questions and answers. From the audience to any panel member here. We have 2 wireless microphones, and we've got runners. So raise your hand, and you're going to get a mic, and we'll take your question. I just want to note that for those watching on the web stream, we can't take questions today. The department will, however, be hosting a webinar in the summer to allow those questions and answers to take place. For those in the audience, as we begin the question and answer period, all I ask is that you use a mic. I have a booming voice. I don't need a mic, but trust me, just to allow it to be recorded, we'd like you to speak into the microphone. Identify yourself by name and affiliation, if any. So without further ado, welcome.
Hello, thank you. My name is Kevin Camps, and I serve as radioactive waste specialist at Beyond Nuclear, and also a board member for Don't Waste Michigan, representing the Lake Michigan chapter. And my question is to John Kotek. Is this a Department of Energy National Environmental Policy Act proceeding? And if so, were all of these comments just made officially recorded as official public comments? If not, why not?
This is not a NEPA proceeding. We don't have an ongoing NEPA activity.
Why not?
We're not. We're starting to design a process. I don't think we're at the right point for that now. Be interested in hearing more of your thoughts on why you think we ought to go down that road just yet. But
so the 30 minutes of public comment at the tail end of today, the written comments going into the various inboxes at DOE are not legally binding in any way?
What we're going to do at the end of the process is, we're going to make comments public. We're going to publish a report that summarizes what we've heard and then also lays out a draft of a path forward for what a consent-based siting process will look like. So there'll be a reporting back mechanism as part of this.
If this is not a NEPA compliant proceeding for high-level radioactive waste and consent-based process, then what possibly would constitute a NEPA proceeding for the Department of Energy?
I don't know where you're going with that, but this is not one. I mean, again, we're here to get we're getting people's input on the design of a
Where
consenting
I'm
siting
going with that
process.
is it seems like this is very much a public relations exercise with no legal binding aspect to it, which we've been through many times before, and it seems like we're going through it again.
Okay. Thanks for that perspective.
Thanks, Kevin. Another question?
Hello, everybody. I'm Julie Samuels. I'm just a resident. I've been involved in environmental issues all my life, virtually, since I was born in 1944, and I think that's when this all started. I had one question to Mr. Kotek. You mentioned to the point that nuclear waste would be processed and then it would be disposed of. So what I'd like to know is, how is it processed? By what, how, when, and where? What does it turn into, and then where does it go?
Yeah, so the waste requiring processing is the high-level waste that we have. So for example, there are wastes in tanks at the Hanford site and the Savannah River site and in Idaho that liquids that need to be solidified before you would dispose those. So there's a technology called vitrification that's being used down at Savannah River. They plan on doing something similar up at the Hanford site. In Idaho, there's a little different technology. They're trying to use a steam reforming technology there, but to solidify the waste prior to disposal. For spent nuclear fuel, some other nations reprocess the fuel. They dissolve the fuel in an acid, extract uranium and plutonium that can be reused, and then vitrify, solidify the rest of the waste. We don't do that here in the U.S. with commercial fuel. So I had mentioned that as just something that folks may have heard of that's used other places, but it's not something we do here in the U.S. So the thought with commercial fuel here is that would just be direct disposed.
So you really don't know how to do that?
You don't know how to do which?
To really create a substance that is not radioactive and can be disposed of safely?
Oh, it's certainly going to be radioactive. But we also, we believe in the national or the global scientific consensus is that you can, in fact, safely dispose of this material in deep geologic repositories. So that's what we intend to do.
Okay, so the stuff that's being produced here in Illinois isn't water-based, is it?
No, if you take a look at the fuel assembly, the mock-up that's over there in the corner, envision something roughly 3 times as tall, but that's the fuel that's then going into first the pools and then into the dry storage containers, so it's very much a solid.
Okay, so in other words, this is horrible contamination forever. Thank you.
Other questions? One right here.
My question is for Kim Wasserman.
Can you just, I'm sorry, name first, please?
Oh, I'm Bonnie.
Okay.
And my question is, I would like to know how the residents of the South Side communities will feel about having thousands of truckloads and train car loads of radioactive waste coming through their communities, making them very vulnerable within, I don't know, a mile or two of serious exposure to radioactivity.
Absolutely. So that's one of the things that's bringing a lot of, I think, communities together around Chicago is the question of what's being transported on the rails around us, and folks understanding and seeing across the United States and across the world just incident after incident after incident of trail derailments in all kinds of transportation incidences. And given that we are a transportation hub in Chicago, it's a very big concern. There's a lot of organizing already happening on the tar sand crude oil front, and I think this is only an extension. I think that this is why when we think about nuclear, it can't just be the site itself, it's the life cycle of it and what does that look like. And everything for transportation particularly is, as Dave said, is very concerning. And I think in order to keep communities the safest, transportation of it has to be minimal. It cannot be more than once, if even that. And so I think even the question of, even if a community isn't housing a nuclear site, but if the transportation is going to go through their community, those communities have to be part of the conversation at the end of the day, because Lord forbid anything happened to them, where do they get left out in the conversation? So part of this also has to include all of the communities that are going to be impacted either through the transportation or in some capacity or another through this process.
Did that answer your question?
Yes, and
Okay.
I have one more part to that, which is that I think that communities that are already at a disadvantage economically and culturally, will have less resources and less ability to cope with the challenges of this kind of endeavor. And so I'm particularly concerned about those communities like on the south side. And I think that's also a community that has a lot of rail, a lot of highways. I mean, I looked at the map of Chicago, and we have, it looks like we have a lot of routes and a lot of train tracks going through our community. So I think the vast majority of Chicagoland in the suburbs, and I know I and my family live within a few blocks of I-94, which is a major hub. And I am very concerned from a public health standpoint about our highways being congested with these truckloads of waste going up and down. And I don't feel safe, and I don't, you can try to cover that up however you want, but I don't think like people would be studying. I mean, it's on the internet. The Council of the State Governments has written their reports for emergency response, and also having been in situations where I've been a first responder after 9/11 as part of the Red Cross, and also at the receiving center for public health for people that were coming from the Katrina disaster. I am very concerned about any kind of plans that are made, and I think we need to really, be careful here. And I'd like to just know particularly about people that are at a disadvantage in these kind of communities.
Thank you very much.
If I could add one thing to that, just to clarify, the way we envision moving material around, just so you know, is by rail, not by road, except as required to get to rail access. With respect to working with the state in communities, it really is the states that have the emergency preparedness and emergency response training, along with tribes, to the effect that tribal governments are impacted. We do work extensively with your state agencies, so I would encourage you, to the extent that you're interested in that, learning more. Are you an Illinois resident? Am I right? So work with the folks, and there may be some people here in the room who maybe you can come up to you in a break, who work on emergency preparedness for rail transportation here in the state, because this is an activity that goes on even now. There's not as much fuel being moved as we'll have to move to, when we get a repository open, but this sort of thing does happen now, and it's worth talking to the folks, understanding how they prepare for such shipments. But thanks for your comment.
Other questions? There's one right here.
Good afternoon. My name is Gail Snyder, and I serve as board president of Nuclear Energy Information Service. And I'm wondering if this process that the Department of Energy is going through is really a process to evaluate and then make their sales pitch to Congress that this is what we should do with nuclear waste, because the directive, as I understand it, is for a permanent geologic repository, and that centralized interim storage, the concept of that is really coming out of a blue ribbon commission, and that's not really, as I understand it, maybe you can correct me, that's a congressional directive to move into this. So the way this is kind of constructed, even trying to get consent, it seems like this is what we're doing. This is what Congress wants us to do, and there's no going back and looking at whether or not this is really something we want to do, because it's just on the freight train to move forward. So if you can explain that.
Yeah, sure, and thanks for the comment. What we're doing in DOE is we're implementing the administration strategy, which builds on the report of the Blue Ribbon Commission, which you referenced. Congress did, in fact, in the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of '87, directed us to just focus on construction of a repository. There have been proposals in the past for construction of consolidated interim storage, and so, for example, there was a nuclear waste negotiator established under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act as well to look for communities that might be willing to host consolidated storage facilities. So that's long been envisioned at least as potentially a part of the nuclear waste management system. The Blue Ribbon Commission certainly recommended consolidated storage as a part of the system for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that we can begin to move fuel out of these communities that currently host shutdown plants. Can also help to reduce the federal liability. One of the things I didn't touch on in my talk earlier is that the federal government pays hundreds of millions of dollars a year right now out of something called the Judgment Fund because of the government's inability or failure to start receiving nuclear waste as required under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act in 1998. The liability to the government estimated for that failure runs into the tens of billions of dollars. So, I mean, there's a real economic reason. There's the reasons that you heard the mayor cite earlier about communities wanting to have access to land. There are several shutdown reactor sites around the country where literally all that's left is the spent fuel storage. The reactor's gone, turbine hall is gone, administration building's gone, everything's gone. You could be in that position here in a few years, if I understand, 2 years. Okay, we think it makes sense to consolidate that material into one location with the capabilities there to manage that material safely for the long term. So that's something certainly that we have incorporated into our strategy. How the Congress reacts to that, I mean, we'll see. We've got, within our budget request to the Congress, we've got a request for funding to move forward with implementation of this strategy, and we'll see how they react.
David?
I just want to add a little response to that, too, because you touched on a couple of things that I think are important. Again, it's the issue of how are the agencies going to overcome public perception is going to be a big piece of this. And while on the one hand you mentioned emergency preparedness, and actually in Illinois we have a pretty good system set up here with IEMA and the Illinois Department of Nuclear Safety. We have some representatives here today. At the same time, the NRC is starting to argue that emergency response around those decommissioning reactor communities should be lessened. So there's kind of a mixed message going out publicly on the issue of emergency response. And somehow the agencies are going to have to get on the same page about that. You also mentioned the Judgment Fund, the liability issue, and that's significant because it's economic. But organizations like ours have proposed alternatives to get around that, so it doesn't become the boogeyman that beats you over the head to drive you to a decision you don't want. For example, one thing that was brought up is the issue is a contract was violated, and again we're talking consent and contracts. And so that's why we have to pay into this fund these penalties from the government, from the taxpayer. Okay, so why don't we nationalize the spent fuel pads, making them federal property, physically taking title of them, and then contracting out to the utilities and paying the utilities to manage them safely? It totally terminates the whole issue of liability because now you've fulfilled your obligations under the Act. This was brought up years ago by many organizations like mine. We brought up the issue of Haas in the year 2002. The NRC rejected it. The industry rejected it. So that's been the pattern and the history of alternatives have been suggested and have been rebuffed repeatedly. And now the DOE is coming forward with a process saying, trust us, consent. You've got a problem there.
I've got Professor Rosner first, then we've got somebody in the back there who hasn't spoken yet, so we're going to go to her after Professor Rosner.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment about the issue of pointing fingers. One of the complications of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982 is that the way the waste fund was set up is that it's part of the funds that it received from the fee that we heard about earlier are treated as part of the general revenue stream. What that means is that in order to expect, for DOE, for example, to touch money from the waste fund, it actually needs congressional approval. That money is scored, technically in political speech, it's scored as part of the revenue stream and also the deficit. And What that means is that you immediately have political interference. One of the conveniences, it turns out, of the judgment fund is that the judgment fund is not subject to the appropriations process. In other words, from everybody's point of view who is involved in actually these transactions, there's actually a benefit to using the judgment fund as a source of money because you don't have political interference. And that, in fact, is sort of a handicap of the way that the Waste Act was originally formulated, that it was formulated so that right from the get-go, you were guaranteed to have political influence in the way the money was spent from the waste fund. And that was probably a mistake.
Thank you, Professor Rosner. We've got a question in the back.
Sorry, I'm not used to using the microphone. My name is Pat Walter. I'm a member of the Citizens Act to Protect Our Water. I have 2 suggestions and 2 questions. The suggestion is that you have experts at any of these meetings. I was at a recent meeting in Zion, and all we had was basically somebody that sounded like a general contractor that tried to explain what was happening with the decommission in Zion. And one of the things that came up there was a question that I was asking was about the water. And yes, there is water that comes out of the waste plant, so water is impacted. And from what I was told later on and after at the meeting, there's something called tritium that goes into the water. So yes, our lakes, which are representing 20% of all the fresh water on our planet, are being impacted by the nuclear waste and the nuclear plants. So that's my suggestion, is that include proper experts at all meetings, especially when you're working on a decommission of a plant, and if Zion is the first one in the United States. You must have better representatives. And the second thing is there's another question, is that you must work, or sort of a question and a suggestion, is working with the railroads. Galena, Illinois had a bomb train. I had a bomb, that could have been a bomb train a half mile from my house. 2 people were killed when the train collapsed on the, whatever the thing that goes over the roads in Glendale, Illinois. So trains are a problem. They're not built for people. They're not built for sensitive cargo. So I really, really hope that your agency is going to work with whoever's in charge of the railroads, because if you're putting anything sensitive on them, we have to be extra, extra careful. So my final suggestion is that to have a citizens committee, such as they've had throughout the country, if you're going to involve a variety of components where you've got citizens, you've got different states. For example, you know, we're next to Indiana, Wisconsin. We've got Wisconsin right now that is one of the cities there is trying to ask for access to Lake Michigan water. A lot of these are interdepartmental, they're interstate. Folks have to work together. So I guess what I'm asking for is, number one, to make sure that if any future Zion meetings include a lot more people, and that the committee continues for the full life of anything that is on that site. Because right now I was told that the committee up there is going to be disbanded when the private company leaves. So thank you very much for having this meeting. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Do you want to pick that up, John, or the mayor?
Yeah, I mean, we, the Energy Department, don't have responsibility for the Zion project, but I can certainly pass that message along to folks that do. And I'm Mayor, you're probably in an even better position to let folks know.
Yeah.
So, but thank you.
And if I could address that a little bit, I think we also have a problem trying to figure out where we get our answers. We've been dealing with Exelon and Commonwealth Edison for years on issues at the power plant when it was operating, and now with the storage. And their response to us is that there is a contract that was broken between the federal government and Exelon has no responsibility to Zion right now except to keep them safe. When we talk to federal representatives, there are definitions and there are contracts that are written that we weren't part of, didn't know anything about, and one of the issues that we're talking about is what's the definition of an interim storage facility, and they have one definition, and we obviously have another. So those are issues, and I guess my recommendation is that, and there's a representative here from Congressman Dole's office. and they've been very helpful with us, is that rather than looking at what we have in some of these agreements, we need to figure out what do we have to change in the legislation, and we need to be creative, and our legislators and our friends at the Department of Energy need to get together and be creative and come up with some different solutions and not go back and look at the old things. We need to be thinking forward on how we can solve some of the problems. And I'm not suggesting that you're not doing that, but I would encourage you to do it much faster.
And then one last point to your comment about experts. So when this is done, we are going to have a little poster session at the end. I actually do have a series of experts sprinkled around the room who can talk to those, to the issues that we're here to talk about in terms of storage, transportation, and disposal of waste. If you find that my experts aren't up to snuff, let me know and I'll get new ones. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got one. Actually, you've already spoken, so there's somebody who hasn't spoken yet. If that's okay, if I give it to her, then we'll come back to you. Thank you.
Yeah, I do. Thank you. My name's Kathleen Rude, and the understanding or the basis behind this conversation of consent-based siting and is the idea that going out into communities and explaining to them exactly what we're looking for. Hi, we have this highly radioactive waste that is going to be deadly for thousands and thousands of years. We'd like to host it here. And the more information that they know about it, that at some point some community is actually going to say, yes, we want that here. And my guess is that for everyone on the panel, everyone in this room, I doubt that any of us would say, hey, bring it to my neighborhood. And I'd like to know if anyone here in this room would be saying, yes, let's bring that to my neighborhood. So I'm really curious as to why any community would want to have a facility here if they really understand exactly what's being asked of them.
Yeah, thanks for the comment. What you find, I think, around the country, and certainly where I live. So I lived in Idaho Falls, Idaho, which is home to the Idaho National Laboratory. That's actually a community that, a few years ago, sent a letter to our governor saying, hey, we'd like to potentially look at this. You've got communities in the Southwest right now, one in New Mexico, one in Texas, that have, even before we've been out looking for volunteers, they've said we're interested in hosting facilities for storage. I mentioned earlier that why? Well, I think they're familiar with the technology. One of the communities in southeastern New Mexico hosts something called the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant. They actually championed the construction of that facility there over a period of 25 years. So they're familiar with nuclear waste disposal operations. I mentioned the situation in Canada. They went out. They looked for volunteer communities, not saying, hey, you need to sign up on day one, but communities that were interested in learning more and participating in the process. They either had 21 or 22. They actually had to terminate their window. They had more than enough to deal with. So I wouldn't expect every community in the United States to step forward and be interested in this, but you don't need every community to do that. You need it.
Are these communities that have a strong economic basis, or are these poor communities? And what are they being promised? What are they being?
Well, we haven't
There's got to be some reason.
Yeah,
because
we haven't promised anything. We're not in that stage of negotiation. What I can tell you about the two that are well documented that have stepped forward. Again, the one in southeastern New Mexico hosts the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, so they're familiar with nuclear waste disposal operations, and then the one in West Texas hosts something called WCS, the Waste Control Specialists Waste Disposal Facility in near I think it's near Andrews, Texas. And so again, those are communities that have some experience with this type of work and are interested in potentially taking some more on. I'm optimistic that through this process we will identify other communities that are interested not in saying yes on day one, but in learning more, potentially playing a role either as for storage or disposal facility or both. So
are you saying that the folks in Carlsbad and in WIP now are saying that they would be interested in taking.
Yeah.
The reason I ask that is because in our packet, when we were given materials to prepare, there's an article called Consent-Based Siting, What Have We Learned? It's from Radway Solutions in 2013. And they do talk about the WIP facility, but one of the paragraphs caught my eye in reading it because it's 2016 now and not 2013. And the passage is, the passage of the WIP Land Withdrawal Act in 1992 resolved many conflicts, and then they go explaining what those were. A second National Academy of Sciences study concluded that unless the site is breached by humans sometimes in the future, there is no credible, probable mechanism for release of radioactive material into the surrounding environment. And I wonder how they feel about that now after the kitty litter episode where they burped plutonium into the community.
Yeah, all I can tell you is I was on a panel 2 weeks ago with a representative of the Eddie Lee County Alliance in southeastern New Mexico, and they're still interested.
Okay.
Could I ask Kim to sort of weigh in a little bit on this? We're talking about communities and self-determination and their rights and access to information. Would you want to sort of weigh in on one way or the other?
So I can't speak for any one community because I don't, but I can say that I think in our neighborhood, what we're seeing is, in our case, we shut down a coal power plant, right? Folks understood air quality issues, they understood, right, why that was important, and now two things are happening in our community. One is our land is being looked at for higher value, right, because we cleaned up the air, we built a new park, we got better public transportation, so we're being displaced by the work that we did. And there's a huge influx now of diesel in our community, right? We're being highlighted for logistics and transportation, right? And so automatically the city came to us and said, look, transportation jobs for everybody, this is going to be great. And folks took the lessons learned from the coal power plant and said, wait a minute. Let's talk about what's coming out of the diesel emissions. Let's talk about the quality of jobs. Are we talking temp jobs? Are we talking union paid jobs? Are we talking local hiring for the first year or for the life of your business? We have a huge flooding problem in the neighborhood. Are you thinking about green infrastructure? So very much the narrative that they originally thought that they were going to come in and sell us with very rapidly was turned back around to say, no, we've been down that road. We've learned as a community, right? And hopefully in this case, those communities are learning as well to say, we're not going to fall for the pretty pictures and the questions of we're going to start to push back and ask questions. And I would hope any community, if empowered to have the technical expertise, the lawyers, the scientists to explain information, can come back and say, we have a list of concerns and questions about consent-based or about these things before we even can go down the path of saying, yes, we want this in our neighborhood. So I think it's really, one, to ensure that folks are giving communities the toolboxes and the opportunities and the investments that they need to come to strong, self-determining places and make decisions, but at the same time, the communities aren't just being sold out on the question of jobs, that local CDCs, community development corporations, government officials, health officials, planning folks, workers, everybody and their mom has a space to lift up and talk about what their concerns are, and that those concerns aren't just placid and say, oh, yeah, we heard you, great, thank you, we got it on documentation, great, thank you, but know that there's really a place where then folks have to come back and say, we heard you on here, and here's what we can do, here's what we're willing to do, or here's how we can change it.
Yeah, I think that was excellent. It really feeds into what we're trying to do. I mean, I think that the way I personally look at it is, any community that's going to be willing to take this on is going to have to be able to answer two sort of threshold questions. One, can this be done in a way that is protective of people and the environment? And then second, if the answer to the first one is yes in the view of that community and that state or that tribe, then can we do this in a way that our community is better off for having taken this on? And that can mean a lot of things, right? And maybe that means the state or the community wants some sort of regulatory role. They want some sort of role in the management or oversight of the operation. They want to see job creation, educational opportunities, et cetera, a full range of things. And part of the reason we have requested the $25 million for grants for next year is so that communities can don't just take it from us, go off and get your own experts and study these issues on your own. I mean, I think that's an essential part of getting to the point where a community can be a willing and informed host.
Kim, do you want to follow up on that?
I just want to flag too, though, that I think there has to be very clear clarity on kind of who experts are, right, and what they're going to sell you on expert-wise, right, because I could be an expert and want to sell you on something and only give you a limited view, so I also raise a flag on what we mean when we talk about who experts are and kind of the viewpoint that they bring.
If I could share from experience, when the Illinois Department of Nuclear Safety was trying to site a low-level radioactive waste dump, they actually did provide a fund for expert testimony and witnesses, which community groups and anyone could apply for. I think there was a ceiling of $5,000 or something. Then you need advice as to how you pick your experts, and that's a whole other issue. But the point was, it was totally independent, it was available, it was and utilized, and seemed to be pretty successful.
Thanks, Dave. So we've got a conversation right now. It's kind of honing in on experts, community choice, resources, those sorts of things. Is there a follow-on question to that, or do you want to go off on something else? You've got your hand. How do I resolve? So, how about you first, and then I'm sorry. How do we do this? She got it? All right. You get the prize.
I'm Jan Bodart, and I'm a member of the Nuclear Energy Information Service. This conversation has raised so many issues with me, I just have a hard time picking one. On the subject of experts, I will only say that there was a nuclear expert named Szilard who became an expert in smoking, and he was a person who promoted what is called the Merchants of Doubt, and he was not really an expert in the field that he was given credit for, although he was a world-famous physicist, and he promoted smoking. The first thing I have to say is no complete disclosure is possible because the nuclear waste lasts for 100,000 years. If you consider the half-life of plutonium, and if you follow the 10 half-lives idea, some people say 20 half-lives. Some people say 20 half-lives, but some people only say 10. And if you go by 10, then this stuff lasts for 100,000 years. And the United States is something like 250 years old or 300 years old. And so it's idiotic to even say that we're giving people complete disclosure, because we're all going to have progeny that are going to have to live with these problems. And I wanted to say something about Carlsbad, because I have someplace, if I could just find it, the testimony of a man who lived in Carlsbad when Carlsbad had a really vibrant tourist economy, and it was surviving and doing well until the problems with WIP came along, and the community that this particular person lived in has really been devastated by the problems that were presented by WIP, and especially after the accident at WIP. And now, even though it's theoretically against the law, there is fracking being contemplated and or carried out within a mile of the WIP facility, and this was supposed to have been illegal, but somehow or other companies have a way of getting around the law to do this whatever they want. And and then another thing that really impressed me was when Pat said something, oh, there's something called tritium. Well, it's not something called tritium. It's a radioactive isotope of hydrogen that is incorporated into regular water, and it is very dangerous when it is ingested. And it is very, you'll have to forgive me for going off the envelope here, but it's very irritating to me to see what's happening to the school system in Chicago in particular, but in the United States in general, where we are not educating people so that they will understand what tritium is. And I know people who don't even know what an isotope is, and this is very, very annoying. So I feel that by shorting our education system, we're setting people up for consent because they don't know what they're getting into, because they don't understand the physics and the chemistry behind it. And they don't have friends and relatives who might be more interested in STEM, who could explain it to them or who could speak for them. If we're not going to educate our communities and then we're going to ask for their consent, what we're doing is just simply pulling wool over their eyes. And we have to start with fixing and implementing and supporting and loving the education system.
Thank you very much. Do you want to pick up some of that, John, or not?
As an engineer, I certainly agree with your emphasis on STEM. Frankly, I'm a University of Illinois trained nuclear engineering graduate, so owe a little bit to the state of Illinois for the fine institution you built here. And I think you're right. I think that sort of understanding of the hazards, you mentioned, people not understanding isotopes or understanding radiation. That's that's an important part, I think, of understanding our modern world, and should be part of curriculum in the U.S. in the public school system. The statement you made about fracking within a mile of WIP, I hadn't heard that. I will certainly talk to my colleagues who have responsibility for that project to find out what that what's going on with that. That's not something that I'd heard before. And I'll just say that your comment about the tourism trade in Carlsbad and suffering since WIP, I've not heard that from folks down there in Carlsbad, but one of the folks we see fairly regularly is a former state rep from down there. I'll ask him whether that's something that he's seen.
All right, thanks. And then, there we go. Thanks for your patience.
This is a question for Mr. Kotek. In your slide where you were showing the nuclear fuel chain, you also included a reprocessing spent fuel. You explained that we're not doing that here, but as I understand it, our national labs do work on the idea of reprocessing. So a number of us are concerned about the potential for locating spent fuel in 4, 5 places maybe around the country, and then turning those sites into reprocessing facilities eventually. So I think that's something that communities that are considering this need to understand, that technologies that maybe are not perfected or maybe don't even exist now could change really radically the character and the intended purpose of the original intended purpose for the site. So can you talk about reprocessing and how that could potentially impact this?
Yeah, so you're quite right. We certainly have research going on within my organization, within the DOE National Lab System, including Argonne National Lab, looking at future nuclear fuel cycles. Are there ways of better managing the waste that we generate now, potentially reusing some of the reusable elements and isotopes in the fuel? Not something we do now. It's focused on the long term, probably tied to a next generation of reactors that employ different technology than we use today. No guarantee we'll ever get there, but it's a sufficiently intriguing scientific possibility that we spend some time and effort looking at it. It's certainly not something that we have envisioned as part of our strategy. If you look at the Department of Energy strategy document, you'll see that's not the intended purpose for consolidated storage facilities. It's simply there to be a more efficient way of managing the fuel that we have before it goes into a deep geologic repository.
Okay, David, then Kevin, and one over here. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to ask John a question, but I want to ask the audience a question before. How many folks here are sociologists, social psychologists, geographers, demographers? Oh, come on, 1? 2, excuse me.
I count
Okay.
3.
Oh, 3,
4.
okay, great. Wow, we just tripled. The reason I'm asking it, I'm going back again to the experience we had in Illinois on consent base for the low-level dump. One of the things I tried to interject into the discussion then is the contract is bigger than just, we need your land, we're going to give you these things, jobs and whatever, and we agree. And I think this gets back to the situation at Zion in a sense. It's bigger than that, and I would like DOE to take some time and examine the notion that a consent community that ultimately takes a facility also has an obligation. And the obligation is not just to the community for the jobs and the economics and this, stuff there. They have an obligation to the nation to take some of the most intensely deadly material ever produced in our infrastructure. And if they screw up, the whole nation suffers. So I bring that up in the context of what happens when you create a community like this, and how does the DOE or other agencies deal with the unfortunate side effects of company towns? For example, you have a certain workforce. Will they be as inclined to report safety issues if they see that whistleblowers around the country are being persecuted, or if that it would have a negative economic impact on the community? So there's a real issue there of how safe is safe in a company town that is suddenly, taking on the nation's responsibility for disposal or even storage of high-level radioactive waste. And that's where the social sciences come in, and that's why I asked you folks, what's your background? Because that always happens at these conferences. That is an aspect of community that seems to be totally ignored.
Yeah.
All right, I'm doing.
Certainly the social science aspects of what we're doing here are extraordinarily important. It's a capability that you've seen we got a few folks on our team who've got that background. Frankly, that's an area that we need to expand some because, what we found in the U.S. is, this is not so much a technological challenge, although the technology is certainly challenging. You got to make sure you get that right. But we think in the U.S. and other countries we've demonstrated that it can be done safely. It's been a sociopolitical challenge principally. Your point about ensuring safety in communities, states taking on issues of national importance and taking on a big safety responsibility. That absolutely. I mean, we have that today. We've got national labs or installations that are responsible for nuclear weapons management or for radiological or biological or chemical weapons research or destruction or what have you. I mean, we've got communities and installations that take on those sorts of challenges for the nation now, and we'll need to ensure that whatever community or communities take on this challenge are up to the task.
Okay.
If I could follow up on that, it's interesting in our community that we've talked with Exelon on numerous occasions about the safety of having the storage on the lakefront, and particularly on the lakefront, but also in our community. And they assure us over and over and over again that nothing can happen. These are absolutely safe. Nothing can happen. Our question to them is, why do you have armed guards in a bunker 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, if nothing can happen? And they say, well, if somebody decided, well, that to me, that's something happening. And they don't recognize that, and I think that has to be addressed. And I don't mean to be, well, I probably do mean to be, but the people that are guarding this are not the best and the brightest. They're not making, $40 an hour. And that's frightening also. And I think that if you're going to get into the consent-based siting, that you have to ensure that there needs to be a standard on who's guarding these things.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's 2:42. I've got time for two more questions. So I've got Kevin, and I've got right there, and then we're going to wrap it up. We good? All right.
Hello, Kevin Camps, Beyond Nuclear and Don't Waste Michigan, and this is, again, directed at John Kotek. So during your introductory presentation, you listed Canada as a consent-based siting model to follow, and our organization's being deeply engaged in the Canadian situation. I have to ask you for a correction on the record. The Deep Geological Repository for high-level radioactive waste is very much in the infancy stage, but there is a proceeding The low and intermediate level radioactive waste, DGR, so-called, targeted at the Bruce Nuclear Generating Station in Kincardine, which is very much indefinitely suspended right now because of the controversy that extends to here. The city of Chicago, all of the counties around here have passed resolutions opposing the DGR for low and intermediate level radioactive waste on the Lake Huron shoreline for good reason. And the Canadian Environment Minister at the federal level has just suspended the proceeding, effectively, requesting additional information from the proponent, Ontario Power Generation, for one thing, the cumulative impacts of the low and intermediate dump being just down the road from the proposed high-level dump. And you mentioned 22 communities now whittled down to 9. 3 of those are in the immediate vicinity of the Deep Geological Repository number 1. There are so many proposed on the shoreline there that we have to give them numbers. So it's a highly contentious issue, highly controversial. Groups like Save Our Saugeen Shores and Stop the Great Lakes Nuclear Dump have sprung up in those neighboring communities to say no for years now. So if that's your model for consent-based siting, how about the non-consent from 23 million people in the Great Lakes Basin to these proposals? Why didn't you mention that?
What I was referring to, of course, was the fact that they started a process through which they were trying to identify willing and informed host communities. That was the point of the discussion. And so, of course, as I mentioned earlier, they've had 21 or 22 communities come forward, express interest in hosting a deep geologic repository. I understand that Ontario Power Generation, different organization, is behind this other proposal, which I didn't discuss. It's not a spent fuel repository, and that's what we're here talking about. But I mean, appreciate you pointing that out. Certainly, we're following the situation up there. But the Nuclear Waste Management Organization in Canada, I think, has actually had a very successful experience in setting up a consent-based siting process, and it's I mean,
the
obviously
Nuclear Waste Management Organization is Ontario Power Generation.
Yeah.
It is the Nuclear Utilities of Canada, dominated
understand.
by Ontario Power Generation.
Yeah.
There's a great new film called Nuclear Hope that just came out, and it examines one of those communities of the 22 you mentioned. I believe it's Hornpain, but I could be mistaken. And the reason for them volunteering was they need the money.
Well,
they're desperate for the cash. And so those 2 proposals, DGR number 1, low and intermediate, DGR number 2, which is high, they are very much joined at the hip. The Canadian Environment Minister has just pointed that out and asked for a cumulative impacts assessment on the 2 dumps, close relationship to each other. So you can't sidestep the issue that this is related to spent nuclear fuel in Canada, and Chicago and, as I mentioned, 184 resolutions representing 23 million people have said, just don't do it.
Yeah, well, okay. Obviously, what we're trying to do is come up with a durable solution that works with states, tribes, local governments that are interested in, as I said, being willing and informed hosts, and that meet the safety criteria that are going to be set for either storage or disposal facilities. That's what we're aimed towards. I mean, we all know this stuff exists. Even if you shut down all the nuclear plants in the country today, you'd have 85,000 metric tons of spent fuel you've got to do something with. We're trying to develop a responsible solution to that, and look forward to having your help in getting there.
The Saugeen Ojibwe Nation has not given its consent to the DGR in Canada. So there's just so many levels to how that is not consent-based.
We will not look for a site in Canada.
All right,
You brought up Canada. I did not bring up Canada.
It's a model, Kevin, all right?
And it's going very, very badly. So if you're going to follow that model, then God help us.
So we're going to go over one last question. Can we get a mic over here?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Actually, okay. I pointed to somebody else, but we're going to let you go first, and you go second, and we're going to wrap this up.
I should be pretty quick.
Thank you.
I'm Juliana Pino. I'm Policy Director at the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization. I work with Kim, who's sitting on the panel. I just had 3 remarks. The first is that when we're thinking about designing consent-based processes, we need to think about barriers to access those processes and resourcing participants. I would point DOE to the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council guidelines on public participation. They speak to the special barriers present for communities that are already under environmental duress and what measures should be taken in actual engagement with those communities to facilitate people not only being informed but also being able to communicate their perspectives accurately. So I would say that that is of utmost importance if you are actually looking at consent and informed consent.
Thank you.
My second point is just about cautioning the group that's working on this around site selection and not assuming that communities that are already dealing with active nuclear sites or decommissioned sites, that they would be then more willing to host new siting of storage. I think often in environmental literature, for economic reasons and for other reasons, there are assumptions that once communities are overburdened, that makes them better candidates for siting. And I would argue that because those communities are overburdened, that they're not good candidates for siting. And I think that's partially due to the compounding impacts on public health and economic impacts, but also because those communities are already operating under duress, which makes it difficult for them to actually give informed consent to new sites. And so I just wanted to make that point. And then the third is just a brief point on considering from the beginning just transition as you start to think about some of the issues that will come up for communities who experience, say, market shifts or economic challenges from the loss of nuclear income and how to better replace those funds with new energy sources.
All right. Thank you very much. So do you want to go last? Okay, we're good. We're now, thank you all for a good and thoughtful series of conversations. We're now headed into the break. But before we do that, hold on a little bit, I want to describe what happens when you return. We ask that when you come back from the break, that you feel free to divide into small groups around these tables. All right, and I'll tell you more about that in a second. The goal here is to allow you to explore amongst yourselves more deeply the issues around consent-based siting that you've heard already this afternoon. There are no prescribed topics for this discussion, but in your packet is a sheet of paper, which I have one here, which gives you some suggested themes and lines of exploration that you may use if you want to guide your conversation. Each table will have the services of a neutral facilitator, and their job is entirely to let you have a productive dialogue. So 2 things. I want to ask the facilitators to stand up and raise their hands, just so you know who they are. Thank you very much. And secondly, we're just trying to get a head count here for who's going to stick around for the facilitated small group discussions. Once those happen, there's going to be, that's an hour long, then we've got a reporting back period that's also going to be part of this session. And then following that's a public comment. So, quick show of hands, who wants to stick around for the facilitated small group discussions, which are going to start 15 minutes after our break is over. Okay, just thank you very much. I was trying to get a handle on that. I appreciate it. Public comment. If you want to, we have a 30-minute public comment following the report out session. If you wish to make a public comment, there's a sign-up sheet at the registration desk. I'd ask you to put your name there so we have a sense of how many people are making a comment. For those on the webinar, multiple small group discussions do not make for good television. So we're going to put the web stream on pause, and we'll restart it once the reporting back happens from the small group discussions. So with all of that, it is now 2:52. I'd like you back here in 15 minutes to start the small group discussions. We're going to have flip charts and poster boards and stuff. And then for those on the webinar, we're going to press the pause button. We'll see you in 75 minutes. Fair enough? Thank you very much.